What if the map of the world you have stared at since kindergarten is a lie? Not a simplification, not a mistake, but a deliberate architectural deception designed to hide the structural reality of the planet you live on. We are told the Earth is an oblate spheroid, slightly flattened at the top and bottom due to centrifugal force. But in 1906, a man named William Reed published a book that should have changed geology forever. Instead, it was buried, ridiculed, and relegated to the dusty shelves of pseudoscience. The book was titled The Phantom of the Poles, and its premise was terrifyingly simple. The poles don't exist. Or rather, they don't exist as points on a map. They are illusions. They are openings. William Reed wasn't a science fiction writer. He was a researcher who looked at the reports of Arctic explorers, the men who actually went there and died there, and noticed a pattern of anomalies that mainstream science couldn't explain. He proposed that the Earth is not a solid rock, but a hollow shell. He argued that the flattening at the poles is not just a compression, but a curve inward, an entrance. He claimed that if you keep walking north, you don't cross over the top of the ball. You walk into the interior. And the light you see up there, the aurora borealis, it's not solar wind hitting the magnetosphere. It is the reflection of an internal sun, or the planet's internal molten core, casting its glow out through the open roof of the world. This is the story of the illusion that fooled a civilization. It is the story of lost expeditions that saw things they weren't supposed to see. Warm winds in the dead of the Arctic winter. Birds migrating north when they should be flying south. Pollen and dust covering icebergs in a region where no vegetation grows. We are going to open William Reed's 1906 dossier and look at the evidence that suggests the Earth we know is just the outer skin of something much more complex. Welcome to the Phantom of the Poles. To understand Reed's theory, you have to strip away everything you think you know about gravity and planetary formation. Reed argued that a spinning sphere naturally hollows out. Think of a washing machine on a spin cycle. The water and clothes differ to the sides, leaving a hollow center. He applied this logic to the molten rock of the early Earth. Why would the center be solid? The centrifugal force of a spinning liquid mass would inevitably push the heaviest material to the outside, creating a crust, a shell. And at the axis of rotation, the top and the bottom, there would be holes. Not cracks, but massive geometric openings, hundreds of miles wide. Reed wrote extensively about the flattening of the Earth. Geodesy admits the Earth is not a perfect sphere, but Reed took it a step further. He suggested that as explorers approached the poles, they were actually walking along the rim of a massive basin. This explains why the compass goes haywire. It explains why the horizon seems to lift up. You aren't walking over a hill, you are walking over the lip of a cup. The optical illusions reported by sailors, mirages of land that shouldn't be there, strange atmospheric refractions, were, according to Reed, glimpses of the opposite side of the internal opening. The implications of this mechanical formation are staggering. It means the Earth has a center of gravity not in the core, but in the shell itself. It implies that gravity would hold you to the surface on the outside and hold you to the surface on the inside. Reed's 1906 text is dry, methodical, and disturbing because it treats this not as magic, but as mechanics. He wasn't talking about elves or mystical kingdoms. He was talking about physics. He was asking the uncomfortable question, why does the logic of rotation apply to everything in the universe except the planet we stand on? Let's talk about the light. The most haunting imagery in The Phantom of the Poles concerns the aurora borealis. Science tells us this is the interaction of solar particles with the magnetic field. Reed called this nonsense. He asked a simple question. If it's solar wind, why is the light so often described as coming from below the horizon? Why do explorers report the sky lighting up from the ground up, rather than the sky down? Reed proposed that the interior of the Earth is illuminated, either by a suspended solar core or volcanic luminosity, and that light spills out of the polar openings like a searchlight pointing into the night sky. Reed wrote poetically, yet analytically, about how this light interacts with the ice. He described the sunlight passing through the hole and hitting the icebergs, illuminating them like authentic crystals of precious stones. Imagine the scene, endless darkness of the polar winter, and suddenly, a glow from the north that makes the ice prisms fracture light into impossible colors. This isn't just a pretty picture, it's a specific optical phenomenon that correlates with the descriptions of colored snow and black ice found in the logbooks of 19th century whalers. This theory of internal light resolves the paradox of the midnight sun and the strange twilight that persists in the Arctic longer than orbital mechanics should allow. If Reed is right, the Earth is a lantern. We are living on the lampshade. And the breathtaking light shows that tourists flock to see in Iceland and Norway are actually the glow of a hidden world escaping through the ventilation shaft of the planet. It reframes the aurora from a celestial event to a terrestrial one. It means the light is coming from inside the house. The strongest evidence Reed compiled wasn't theoretical, it was biological. He obsessed over the migration patterns of animals. In the dead of winter, when the Arctic should be a frozen wasteland devoid of life, explorers documented birds flying north. Not south to the tropics, but north into the ice. Why? Where were they going? Foxes were seen heading north. Bears were seen heading north. There is no food north. Unless, of course, the ice stops. Unless the open polar sea, a theoretical body of warm water that 19th century geographers believed existed, was real, but located just inside the rim of the opening. Reed cites records of vast quantities of driftwood washing up on the shores of Greenland and Svalbard. The wood was often identified as tropical or unknown species. How does a mahogany tree float to the Arctic? Ocean currents, they say. But Reed pointed out that the currents in those regions often flow out from the pole. This driftwood, along with fresh pollen and dust found on the ice, suggested a source of vegetation located beyond the known map. A place where trees grow and rivers flow, pouring their debris out into the freezing oceans of the outer world. This brings us to the mystery of the warm wind. Multiple expeditions, including those of Nansen and Peary, reported sudden, inexplicable rises in temperature as they got closer to the pole. The wind would shift, blowing from the extreme north, and it would be warm. It would carry the scent of earth and water. In the middle of the ice pack, the temperature would jump by tens of degrees. Mainstream meteorology calls this a freak atmospheric pressure anomaly. Reid called it a draft coming from the warm interior of the Earth, blowing out through the open door. The open polar sea is one of the most fascinating failures in the history of cartography. For centuries, the British Admiralty believed that if you punched through the ring of pack ice, you would find a calm, navigable ocean at the top of the world. They sent ship after ship to find it. Franklin, Kane, DeLong. Many died. But those who got close reported seeing the ice thin out. They saw dark water where there should have been solid white. They saw mist and fog, signs of temperature difference. Reid argued that the open polar sea wasn't a myth, it was just misunderstood. The explorers were hitting the edge of the illusion. The ice accumulates at the rim, where the cold of the outer atmosphere meets the warmth of the inner atmosphere. But once you cross that rim, the temperature stabilizes. The phantom of the poles is the optical trickery that happens at this convergence point. The horizon behaves strangely. The sun appears to rise when it should be setting. It is a navigational nightmare that led experienced captains to question their sanity. The tragedy of 19th century exploration is that they didn't know how to interpret the data. They assumed that if they saw open water, they had found a route to China. They didn't realize they were looking at the throat of the planet. Reid claims that many ships marked as lost with all hands didn't sink. They simply sailed into the interior, perhaps unable to return against the currents. Or perhaps they chose to stay. It's a haunting thought. Missing Victorian ships sailing on an internal ocean, their crews surviving in a world that doesn't appear on any chart. Now we must address the visuals, the flattened pole concept. If you look at high-altitude photography, or even old satellite compilations of Earth, you often see a patchiness at the poles, a blur, a composite stitching error. NASA and other agencies explain this as a limitation of orbital mechanics. Satellites generally don't fly directly over the geometric pole, or the lighting conditions make imaging difficult. Reid would say this is a convenient excuse. If the Earth actually curves inward, a satellite looking down would see a distortion. It wouldn't see a hole like a drain in a bathtub. The scale is too massive. It would see a gradual depression that defies standard perspective. The atmosphere would be thicker there. Clouds would spiral into it. The weather patterns we see on weather maps, the massive cyclonic systems that sit over the poles, are behaving exactly as fluids behave when draining into a vortex. The polar vortex is literal. Reid's book includes diagrams that show the Earth not as a circle, but as a pear shape or a flattened torus. He challenged the very geometry of the globe. When you look at the raw data of planetary shape, the geoid, it is lumpy and uneven. The perfect sphere is a mathematical model, not a reality. By smoothing out the data, by correcting the maps to fit a sphere, cartographers have erased the evidence of the opening. We are navigating with a lie. The illusion of the poles is maintained by the projection methods we use to flatten a 3D world onto a 2D piece of paper. Let's move to the strangest corroboration of Reid's theory: the flight of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. In 1947, Byrd undertook Operation High Jump in Antarctica, a massive military armada. The official story is that it was a training mission and a geological survey. But the rumors, the diary entries that have circulated for decades, suggest Byrd flew beyond the pole and saw green lands, mountains, lakes, and forests in the center of Antarctica. While historians dismiss the secret diary as a forgery, the actual radio transmissions from Byrd's expeditions contained cryptic phrases about lands beyond the pole and a continent greater than the United States. If we apply Reed's filter to this, Byrd didn't fly to another dimension. He simply flew over the rim. In an aircraft, the transition would be seamless. You wouldn't drop off a cliff. You would follow the curvature of the land until the down direction shifted. The horizon would remain flat relative to the plane. If Byrd saw vegetation, he was seeing the beginning of the inner biosphere that Reed predicted. The existence of a military clampdown on Antarctica immediately following these expeditions is suspicious. The Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959, is one of the most restrictive international agreements in history. It essentially forbids independent exploration. You cannot just buy a plane and fly to the South Pole. You are monitored, routed, and controlled. Why? Is it to protect the penguins? Or is it to prevent anyone from accidentally flying too far and seeing the curvature invert? The skepticism against Reed is obvious. We have satellites, people say. We have physics. But consider the depth of the Earth. The crust is 20 to 30 miles deep. We have drilled, at maximum, about 7.5 miles down, the Kola Super Deep Borehole. We have scratched the skin of an apple and claimed to know the composition of the core. All our models of the Earth's interior, the mantle, the liquid outer core, the solid inner core, are derived from seismology. We interpret how earthquake waves bounce through the planet. But seismic waves can be interpreted in multiple ways. A hollow sphere with a certain density distribution could theoretically produce similar dampening effects to a solid sphere, depending on the material of the shell. Reed argued that the weight of the Earth was vastly overestimated. If the Earth is hollow, it is much lighter. This would rewrite orbital mechanics, but it might explain anomalies in gravity that we currently use dark matter or complex equations to hand-wave away. Reed's 1906 book was a plea for empirical observation over dogmatic theory. He asked us to trust the eyes of the sailors over the equations of the astronomers. He pointed out that every planet we observe through a telescope is just a 2D disk to our eyes. We assume they are solid spheres because that is the simplest shape. But nature is rarely simple. Saturn has rings. Jupiter has belts. Why is it impossible that Earth has openings? The arrogance of modern geology is assuming that because we have mapped the surface, we understand the volume. There is a psychological component to the Phantom of the Poles. It terrifies us. The idea that we are living on a shell, fragile and exposed, with a vast unknown beneath our feet, is primal horror. It destroys the safety of solid ground. If there is a civilization inside, or even just a biosphere, it raises the question: are we the masters of this planet, or are we just the exiles living on the cold, exposed roof? Reed suggested that the interior would be tropical, shielded from the solar radiation, a paradise compared to the harsh surface. This echoes the myths of Agartha, Shambhala, the Garden of Eden. What if these weren't myths of the spirit, but memories of geography? What if humanity began inside and migrated out? Or what if the others are still there, watching us destroy the surface while they live in the protected core? The phantom is not just the physical pole. It is the phantom of truth. It haunts the edges of our maps. It is the white space where we wrote, "Here there be dragons." Now we write, "Data not available," or "restricted airspace." The terminology changes, but the ignorance remains. Reed's book is 118 years old, and yet no public expedition has ever been allowed to simply fly a straight line across the pole and keep going to see where the geometry leads. In the end, William Reed died without seeing his theory accepted. But his book remains a thorn in the side of certainty. It reminds us that consensus is just a word for what everyone agrees to believe until the paradigm shifts. Plate tectonics was ridiculed as nonsense 50 years before it was proven. The idea of a spherical Earth was once heresy. The hollow Earth is the last great heresy. Maybe the poles are solid ice. Maybe the data is correct. But when you look at the aurora tonight, those dancing lights in the northern sky, ask yourself, are you looking at the sun hitting the atmosphere? Or are you looking at the reflection of a world you are forbidden to know? The phantom of the poles is still there, waiting for the smoke and mirrors to clear. The map is not the territory, and the territory might just be hollow.